Thank you. It's a good crowd. Thank you. And welcome everybody. Welcome to the Lester Grinspoon Reconsidered, celebrating a pioneer of drug policy and a legacy of social change, also known as Lester Fest. And also welcome to the campus of the University of Massachusetts. So SCUA and the UMass Amherst Libraries are honored to be hosting this symposium. We are honored because today, on Lester Grinspoon's 94th birthday anniversary, we have the opportunity, yes, absolutely. We have the opportunity to look at his legacy and examine the founding and incredibly influential role he played in the global movement to end the prohibition of cannabis and to look at all drugs through a scientific lens and understand their value, unbiased by laws and societal norms. We are also honored to be able to host this symposium as we find ourselves in a dramatic historical transition for drug policy, drug use, and science. This symposium is happening as cannabis prohibition becomes the cannabis industry, as psychedelics become more and more recognized as therapeutic tools for a variety of illnesses and for self-improvement, and as we begin to take a hard and honest look at the role the war on drugs has played in mass incarceration and the institutionalized and systemic racism in this country. Thanks to Lester's profound influence and mentorship, we have been able to bring together a who's who of activists, scientists, doctors, scholars, leaders, journalists, lawyers, and psychonauts to discuss these issues and this transition, all of whom understand their debt to Lester's groundbreaking work and advocacy. So the three panels today will look at the past, how we've arrived at this point of transition, where we are now, the current research, policy, and industry of drugs and drug use, and also the future, where we are headed scientifically and in the culture at large, and how drug policy can drive social change. All of this culminating in a keynote by Dr. Carl Hart, whose research and writing in many ways points to a necessary future of drug policy. In the Robert S. Cox Special Collections and University Archives Research Center, our main focus is preserving the history of social change. And as part of that effort, we have been working for over a decade to preserve the history of drug policy and drug policy activists and innovators. Through collections like Lester's Papers, the Records of Normal, the Marijuana Policy Project, and more, we have already begun to tell that story. Our dream, however, is to become the place for researching the history of drug policy. This symposium is an opportunity to build toward that goal, to continue the story of drug policy and social change, and make sure the work of these organizations and individuals are preserved and available and open to all. So I cannot move forward, however, without thanking the many people who have made this groundbreaking event possible. And I have to start, of course, with the Grinspoon family, particularly two of Lester's sons, David and Peter, who I will introduce to you formally in a moment, and also to Lester's widow, Betsy. They are the true architects of this day. Alan St. Pierre, who has been instrumental in the development of our drug policy collections and is also a key part of the symposium planning team. Dick Evans, our local partner and host extraordinaire. Carol Kinnair and Kim Phil from the libraries. Vicki Menrich, who made sure all our panelists got here in one piece. Thank you, Vicki. Our IT team, making sure the symposium looks and sounds good. And of course, our partners at UMass Conference Services. But last, and absolutely not least, I also want to thank archivist extraordinaire Caroline White. Caroline had the pleasure of working closely with Lester to help bring his papers to UMass and worked long, hard hours to make sure Lester Fest came to fruition. I know Caroline loved Lester. I mean, how could you not? And while the symposium is truly a labor, it is also a labor of love. So I can speak with confidence for Caroline and everyone at the SCUA Research Center and the UMass Libraries that we are all overjoyed to have you here in person. Thank you. So I'd now like to introduce our plenary speakers, Lester's sons, David and Peter Grinspoon. David Grinspoon is an astrobiologist whose research focuses on climate evolution on Earth-like planets, potential conditions for life elsewhere in the universe, and the planetary scale impacts of human activities on Earth. He is a senior scientist at the Planetary Science Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Colorado and Georgetown University. David was awarded the Carl Sagan Medal for Public Communication of Planetary Science by the American Astronomical Society. And in 2022, he was elected a Lifetime Fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. He is involved with interplanetary spacecraft missions for NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Japanese Space Agency, and as a musician, leads the house band of the universe. Yeah. Peter Grinspoon is a primary care physician and cannabis specialist at Massachusetts General Hospital, an instructor at Harvard Medical School, a certified health and wellness coach, and a member of the board of directors of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. He spent 2 years as an associate director of the Massachusetts Physician Health Service, helping physicians with addiction and mental health issues, and is the author of the memoir, Free Refills, A Doctor Confronts His Addiction and Seeing Through the Smoke, coming out in 2023. So please welcome the Doctors Grinspoon.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Aaron, for that generous introduction. And thanks to all of you for coming out, and welcome to Lesterfest. On behalf of the family, I'd just like to say we're really grateful to all of you for being here, and especially grateful to the wonderful folks at UMass Archives and Library who've just been such a joy to work with putting this together, and we're thrilled that you are the caretakers of Lester's archives, and we're really excited about the collections and the center that you're building here. And Lester would be so thrilled by what you're doing, and we really appreciate it. Want to set the scene a little bit. I'm going to talk for 20 minutes-ish. In fact, I'm going to time myself. And then Peter's going to talk for 20 minutes-ish. And then if Peter doesn't go on and on way over time, then if there's a few extra minutes, we'll tag team and could take questions and discuss, but then we are going to stop for the 9:30 break. So starting my timer. What I thought I would do is set the scene a little bit by talking about a lot of what Lester did before he got into the issue of drugs and drug reform, and sort of what it was that he, and why, what it was he brought to that, and why I think he ended up focusing on that. One thing I admired about my father was that throughout his life he was capable of learning and changing his mind about things, and that made him a great teacher. Like many intellectuals of his generation, he was enamored of communism when he was younger, and later horrified by the direction it took. His courage in rejecting psychoanalysis, risking alienation from many peers and friends who were committed to a practice and belief system which he had been invested in, but later saw as ineffective and somewhat cult-like, is another demonstration of his capacity to grow and learn. Famously, he started his study of marijuana thinking that the danger to society was people harming themselves with a dangerous drug. And then he learned that there was a societal danger associated with that drug, but it was not what he had thought it was. My brother Peter will talk more about that in a few minutes, and obviously that's central to what we're gathered here today to talk about, but I did want to set the stage by talking about a few other aspects of my father's work, which you may know less about, but which illustrate his areas of interest and character, which led directly into his work on drug policy reform. I think of my dad as the smartest person I ever met. Now, I may be biased, but I was just always amazed at how much he knew about how many things when I was a kid. I think of him as a scientist. He was always so curious. He was hands-on. He liked to tinker and build things. I have so many memories. A random one popped into my mind of when he was showing me how to drain the swimming pool by setting up a siphon with a hose into the woods. And when I was a kid, it seemed magical. You didn't need a pump or anything. You just started it and the water kept flowing by itself. And he explained it to me in terms of air pressure and gravity, and it all made sense. And he was broadly interested in and in love with the natural world. His favorite things were sailing, fishing, and walking in the woods. And in those walks in the woods, he would notice every time what the nest of owls were doing, and when the baby owls were born, and when they had fled the nest. He kept tabs on them. And after he could no longer walk in the woods, when he was physically unable to do that, he was often glued to bird cams on his computer, keeping tabs and watching the nests and reporting on the progress of the hatchlings. As long as I can remember, there was a subscription to Science magazine at our home. As a teenager, he had a famously elaborate chemistry lab in the basement, sometimes filling the home with noxious odors. In fact, there was an incident with hydrogen sulfide filling the house, and when there was a pot of mushrooms boiling on the stove that then did something really horrible to the mushrooms. And because of that incident as a teenager, my dad, the rest of his life, never ate mushrooms. Anyways, be careful with hydrogen sulfide, it's nasty. Lester also experienced some harsh injustice and cruelty as a kid. There was a lot of anti-Semitism from neighbors and from other kids growing up in Newton, which sometimes turned into violence. The anti-Semitic neighbors even once poisoned their beloved family dog. Some sad stories, but also Lester's own father, my grandfather Simon, who I never met, he also modeled great generosity and creativity in responding to injustice in ways that were actually effective in changing some minds. He eventually won a mea culpa and a heartfelt letter of apology from those same neighbors. Lester was always politically engaged and concerned. My parents, Lester and Betsy, actually met on a blind date at an Adlai Stevenson rally. My first political action was being pushed in a stroller in a Ban the Bomb march in 1963. Lester and his longtime friend Carl Sagan first bonded because they were seemingly the only two people on the Harvard faculty who were opposed to the Vietnam War, which was an unpopular position in 1965. He grew up poor and actually never graduated high school. He dropped out to go to work, but he got into college on a naval ROTC scholarship. He excelled there and went to Harvard Medical School, where every specialty fascinated him, but especially psychiatry, which allowed him to combine his interest in the science of human behavior and psychology with his desire to help people. And though we know most about his research, writing, and activism, let's not forget that throughout his whole career, he continued to see patients, evidently with great success, judging by the large quantity of mail he received from former patients, thanking him for helping him get their lives back on track. His whole career, he was very interested in the neurochemistry and psychopharmacology of mental illness. The subject of his first book was actually the psychopharmacology of schizophrenia. And Lester was the first American physician to prescribe lithium carbonate for bipolar disorders. It's interesting that we still don't really know how lithium works. It's strange that such a simple molecule, lithium carbonate, is just a salt, like table salt, NaCl, but if you go to Na and you go up one in the periodic table, you get to lithium. And you combine lithium with carbonate, which is a simple, anyways. It's just salt, but somehow it works, and we don't know why. Probably the lithium does something to the sodium channels, but anyways, it's interesting. Its main use is in making lithium-ion batteries, but somehow it does work. It's interesting that it should have such an effect on human brains. The mechanism isn't understood, but Lester believed in following the evidence. When reading Lester's non-drug and pre-drug scholarship, I'm struck by the intelligence, rigor, and deep well of compassionate concern he brought to bear on everything he did, qualities which later became almost entirely focused on his drug policy work. He was data-driven, but he recognized the limits of reductive approaches when dealing with complex issues of human behaviors and desires, and the need to also consider anecdotal evidence in context. The thread that ties together much of his life's work was that he applied science to social issues and social justice issues. He was concerned with improving the human condition, and he didn't shy away from difficult subjects. His first deep involvement as a more public intellectual was on the psychological dimensions of the nuclear arms race and applying insights from the social sciences toward the issue of preventing nuclear war. In 1961, when he was 33 years old, he had a cover story in the New Republic, Escape from the Bomb, where he took a clear-eyed look at the mechanisms we use for avoiding uncomfortable truths, such as denial, displacement, rationalization, intellectualization, and dogmatism. And he focused on how to help people deal constructively with frightening or unacceptable truths. One of the strange conclusions of that New Republic piece was that the one rational thing anyone in Europe or America could do is move to the Southern Hemisphere. Yet my parents didn't run away. I did not grow up in Australia, although there is a band there now called Grinspoon. And later, of course, with the discovery of nuclear winter, we learned that there aren't really any safe places on Earth to hide from ourselves. Also in 1961, he was among the founders of Physicians for Social Responsibility, a group that tried to help people understand the real consequences of nuclear war and opposed atmospheric nuclear tests. As a matter of fact, when I was little, when we were growing up, we were not allowed to drink milk, fresh milk, only had powdered milk because of atmospheric nuclear tests and the worry about radioactive isotopes contaminating milk. Ironically and sadly, my older brother Danny still contracted leukemia and succumbed to it in 1973. In the summer of 1962, Lester helped organize a major conference on peace research sponsored by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. It included a cross-section of behavioral and social scientists gathered at the Craigville Inn on Cape Cod, living and working together for 5 weeks. Prior to this time, much of the disarmament scholarship and activism had been done by physical scientists. But now, at that point, it was felt that social scientists ought to get involved, and this was the first major gathering of social scientists to deal with those issues. And out of this came a book, International Conflict in Behavioral Science, or the Craigville Papers. And in that book, it is acknowledged right at the beginning that the prime mover of that whole effort was the young Lester Grinspoon. By the way, I had a great time at that meeting, or so I'm told. I was 2 years old at the time, so I don't really remember, but my mom tells me I had a blast playing on the beach with the other kids. And I think it was there that I spoke my first 2 words, which I'm told were beach and boat. Lester wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. In 1963, in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the country was in a frenzy of building fallout shelters and running nuclear drills in schools. He testified in Congress that June before the Armed Services Committee's Subcommittee on Civil Defense about the drawbacks and risks of such a program, including the psychological harm it might do to school children to have their schools turned into nuclear shelters with frequent drills scaring and scarring them. A few weeks before his testimony, a phone call was made to Harvard from the Department of Defense, attempting to intimidate Lester from pursuing the subject. Instead, Lester described this phone call in his testimony, and the intimidation itself then became a subject of discussion by the subcommittee. It wouldn't be the last such attempt to thwart his work by those who felt threatened or offended by it. Concern about the dynamics of the arms race led him to study the psychological aspects of decision-making, the ways in which powerful people become deluded by the social surroundings of their offices. These insights might have helped him later when, in the course of his sometimes controversial scholarship and activism, he came into conflict with various powerful leaders in academia, government, and the media. Lester was not only interested in helping to reveal difficult or hidden truths in order to move society forward, but interested in the process and dynamics of such revelations, in how to get people to change their minds, accept new information, and encourage enlightened social action. My dad followed many other interesting intellectual pursuits, too many to talk about now. The psychology of UFO sightings, he met with astronauts about the overview effect, etc. With his omnidirectional intellectual appetite, he became for many years the chair of the Scientific Program Committee of the American Psychiatric Association, where he organized symposia on topical issues at annual meetings. And he was the founding editor of the American Psychiatric Association Annual Review and Harvard Mental Health Letter, which he edited for 15 years. In this work, he stayed on top of and often editorialized on a broad range of topics regarding mental health, ranging widely beyond the issues he's best known for. Obviously, his work became increasingly focused on the subject which we'll spend most of today talking about, and which the archives here at UMass are centered on. But he stayed involved in the disarmament issue too. In 1981, a group of planetary scientists who had been studying the climate effect of global dust storms on the planet Mars realized that their models were applicable to the global climate impacts of nuclear warfare on Earth. They discovered a previously unknown and unanticipated effect by which the combined smoke and dust from burning cities created a global stratospheric haze, which would cause global freezing and darkness, leading to crop failures and mass starvation even in non-combatant countries. They had discovered nuclear winter. This strange Lovian effect changed the equation for nuclear warfare. It had psychological and policy implications. And in 1984, Lester convened a major symposium in Los Angeles on the psychological and moral implications of nuclear winter, with luminary public intellectuals, including historians, theologians, psychiatrists, and evolutionary biologists. The keynote was given by Carl Sagan, who kicked off the meeting with a rigorous and vivid description of the physical effects of nuclear winter, followed by many discussions of the implications. One of Carl's conclusions was that in the absence of an ability to completely disarm, it should be possible for the nuclear nations to at least reduce their arsenals to a level where they could still serve their deterrent purposes, but not threaten global annihilation. There was a while just post-Cold War where it seemed we might be heading in that direction. Now it seems like a lost opportunity. It occurred to me when writing this that the first interdisciplinary meeting on nuclear war I attended with my family, I was 2 years old, and the last one I was there as a graduate student. So Lester's involvement in the issue was no fleeting interest. And it didn't end there. In 1986, Lester spoke at a demonstration at the nuclear test site in Nevada, organized by several groups, including Physicians for Social Responsibility. And later that day, he was arrested, along with Carl Sagan and 137 others, in an effort to demand that the USA institute a moratorium on underground nuclear testing, as the Soviet Union had already done. Now, 60 years later, I feel we've lost the narrative on this problem. We got distracted by other big problems and by new self-imposed existential threats like climate change. But the nuclear threat never went away. Maybe it receded for a while. And today we're at even a stranger state with regards to that threat. We've become expert at the kinds of denial Lester warned us about, having lived with nuclear weapons for 2 generations. In my own field, astrobiology and SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, we discussed the probable existence of other so-called intelligent civilizations. But I do sometimes point out that we don't even know of the existence of even one yet. Now we are again being held hostage to the nuclear threat in Europe and elsewhere. Writing in 1961, Lester presented a convincing case that nuclear apocalypse is likely to be only decades away. The material factors used to calculate those probabilities in terms of numbers of weapon systems, numbers of nation states with access, etc., have worsened markedly since these estimates were made. Yet, here we are. Some even use the fact that apocalypse hasn't come to argue that this shows that the danger is not as great as we once imagined. This argument is obviously specious. There's a strange kind of anthropic-like principle, a selection of histories, because we would not be having this discussion or any discussions in any of the contingent historical timelines where the end of the world had happened. So we truly don't know how lucky we are, and this can lull us. And yet, it's also true that at the 1983 meeting, All the discussions were framed in the language of the Cold War extending indefinitely. Its end was hard to imagine. Nobody among all those learned people anticipated anything like the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Not that the world has turned into a picnic since then. We've got other big problems now. But the lesson remains, our imaginations are always inadequate, and the future that seems inevitable can, and usually does, turn out to be very different from what anyone predicts. We're bad at seeing the future, and what seems unresolvable often is not. Of course, in the early 1970s, Lester's interests famously converged and focused mostly on the study of marijuana and other drugs, which we will discuss a lot today. How does this fit in with his earlier interests? Well, in a general sense, as I mentioned, he wanted to apply science to solving societal problems. But also, anyone immersed in the thorny questions of peace studies, international relations, and the psychology of conflict is well aware that the problem really comes down ultimately to the need to move humanity forward, to change our limited views of our own possibilities. Because, as Einstein famously said, and Lester was fond of quoting, nuclear weapons have changed everything except our ways of thinking. The need to change our way of thinking requires more and deeper knowledge of ourselves, and the means to spread that awareness in a mass way, it will require more fellowship and self-understanding. Now, some wonk in the 1960s, maybe it was Tim Leary, famously predicted that LSD could prevent World War III. On one level, this prediction seems kind of silly. On another level, one can point out that World War III hasn't happened yet, and at least some of today's decision makers had their worldviews, internally and externally, changed by the psychedelic movement. But that's still a pretty weak argument. A stronger point is that marijuana and psychedelics can be tools for self-understanding. Certainly it can be said that anything which can help us understand human psychology better, help people connect and understand one another better, help us break destructive patterns and imagine ourselves and our world in new ways, this is vitally needed. As Carl Sagan wrote in his Mr. X entry in Marijuana Reconsidered, the illegality of cannabis is outrageous, an impediment to full utilization of a drug which helps produce the sensitivity and insight, serenity and fellowship so desperately needed in this increasingly mad and dangerous world. Here I'm also reminded of Terence McKenna's outrageous idea that psychedelic mushrooms were seeded on Earth by intelligent aliens who wanted to facilitate the evolution of human consciousness. While I don't take this idea seriously as a literal proposal, I see its metaphorical value because the fate of humanity and the Earth and the role that we will ultimately play in the evolution of the cosmos is tied closely to the question of whether we can grow and mature as a species. And the secret to that is undoubtedly increased self-understanding, which these substances, understood in the right way, can clearly help us with. As G.K. Chesterton wrote, "If seeds in the black earth can turn into such beautiful roses, what might not the heart of man become in its long journey toward the stars?" We humans right now can use all the help we can get, and it's a hopeful sign that in no small part due to Lester's life work, we are now at a point where the potential of these substances to help facilitate individual and community healing and forward human self-understanding is once again being explored. Thank you. And now, not bad. 20 minutes and 30 seconds. Now I would like to welcome to the stage my little brother, Dr. Peter Grinspoon.
Thank you so much for coming today. You know, it's funny, I just feel like my dad's looking over my shoulder when I'm speaking. And I'd very much like to thank my understudy for warming up the audience. And I want to correct one thing about your speech, David. Your first two words weren't boat and sun, they were need cannabis. Anyways, what I'd like to do today is discuss who my dad was and what made him that way. First, a few words about what it was like growing up with him as a father. Our household was very unusual because growing up, we were surrounded by the most amazing community of intellectuals and activists. And I remember many of the conversations I overheard or eavesdropped on as a little kid in our living room or around the dinner table. It wasn't just big name luminaries. Our house was constantly populated with the brightest progressive minds of the day: doctors, lawyers, human rights activists, writers, artists. Now, cannabis, psychedelics, and the war on drugs were obviously frequent topics of conversation, and cannabis was the ubiquitous social and intellectual lubricant. But the conversations also tended to focus on, as David alluded to, the most challenging issues that humankind was facing, things like the nuclear threat, environmental destruction, poverty, racism, inequality. And all of this was profoundly inspiring and motivating to me and to my two brothers. Though to me it caused some cognitive dissonance, because at home I'd be listening to, for example, Carl Sagan, as they're passing a joint around, waxing poetic about, what's the nature of consciousness, or is their life in the universe. And then you go to school and, year after year, the same old policeman would waddle in and present the DARE curriculum in the tone of an unmotivated student giving a 5th grade book report on a book that they hadn't even read. And it really begged the question to me. It was really confusing, who is amotivational here? And if someone like Carl Sagan was amotivational, I'd hate to see what motivational looked like. It also begged the question of whether anything they were telling us about drugs was true, and ultimately that's why the DARE program sort of backfired. But on the wall of our childhood home was this beautiful normal poster. It boasted a prophetic quote by the philosopher Spinoza. And the quote is, "He who seeks to regulate everything by law is more likely to arouse vices than to reform them." As a kid, I had absolutely no idea what that meant, but it certainly sunk in, and when I finally did understand, I realized its profound wisdom. It even affected my career choice, as I find myself neck deep in cannabis and other drug issues. So circling back now to what made my dad so unique and so special, what were his essential qualities, and what gave him the tools ultimately to change the world? You see a dispensary and you're like, wow, that wouldn't even be there if it weren't for Lester. So the first word that comes to mind is idealistic. I think who a person picks as heroes says a lot about who they are. And I have a copy of a letter from 1964 written to my dad, and it says, "Thank you for the paper you sent me. I've read it and found it excellent." The paper was on nuclear disarmament, and the person praising my dad was no less than Bertrand Russell, who was a person who mirrored my dad's belief in blending scholarship, integrity, activism, and pacifism. That sounds like an oxymoron, but and that's probably why he was attracted to Carl Sagan. It really, the intellectual, the breadth of Carl's dedication to learning and to activism. Now, my dad was always reading and learning. Part of it was that he saw education as a ticket out of poverty. As my Uncle Harold, who's going to be here this afternoon, can attest, they didn't have two nickels to rub together when they were growing up. In fact, the Adelaide Stevenson date that my dad took my mom on, he took her to for their first date because it was free and he didn't have any money to pay for anything else. But that worked out. He went to Tufts and then to Harvard Medical School, all on scholarships. But the one thing he never did was graduate high school. I'm fairly certain that my dad is the only person in human history who could boast of being both a high school dropout and a magna cum laude graduate of Tufts and a cum laude graduate of Harvard Medical. He had an unusually broad attitude of curiosity and inquiry. He always read, and he read everything: literary fiction, science stuff, political stuff. He was a huge proponent of the liberal arts approach to education. When I was complaining in college about how stupid I thought organic chemistry was, in college I studied philosophy, but I did pre-med on the side, and I was complaining that they made us memorize 760 equations that you could just look up in a book. Why would you do that? My dad explained to me that even as a psychiatrist, it was helpful to know organic chemistry. He pointed out that he understood the molecules and the different cannabinoids when he was writing Marijuana Reconsidered. And then I opened up and looked at my copy of Marijuana Reconsidered, and true to form, the molecular structures were all there. and they kind of made sense because I had studied organic chemistry. I think that personal strength is a really critical component of who my dad was, and it comes from surviving the loss of his dad when he was like 18 years old, either 18 or 20. He lost a brother when he was a teen, and a son, my brother Danny, when Danny was 16. And, you know, he kept moving forward when a lot of people with this much loss would have just flat out given up. Now, I don't think anybody would argue if I used the word prescience to describe my dad. He was so ahead of his time on so many issues. In 1979, more than 40 years ago, he wrote the book Psychedelic Drugs Reconsidered, and also a great book called Psychedelic Reflections, which urged the psychiatric community and society at large to utilize psychedelic drugs as therapeutic agents for depression, addiction, and other maladies. In a 1986 paper, you know, right at when Reagan's war on drugs was like, you know, going full blast, he wrote a paper about psychedelic drugs, and he said, the problem is not so much how to get these drugs off the street, but how to get them back in the laboratory, in the laboratories, hospitals, and other supervised settings. And again, that was like in 1986. That's 34 years ago. And another example of my dad's prescience, in 2014, at the age of 85 no less, he wrote a letter to the NFL commissioner, Roger Goodell, urging him to study CBD as a treatment, a potential treatment for chronic traumatic encephalopathy, because what we know about CBD is that it's neuroprotective. Of course, Robert Goodell ignored him completely, but then, you know, recently I saw a headline, the NFL has announced $1 million to fund research into cannabis and CBD for brain injury. And I marveled again about my dad's ability to come up with solutions before anyone else does, and his tireless efforts to get people to evolve their thinking. My dad had a remarkable ability to grow and to change. He was in his early 40s when three things happened. Number one, he published his seminal work, Marijuana Reconsidered, to widespread acclaim. Number two, Nixon declared his war on drugs. And number three, my parents started illegally procuring cannabis from my brother Danny, who was dying of leukemia and was suffering horribly from the chemotherapy they were giving him. And it really helped him. It really made the last year of my life, of Danny's life, so much more livable and sort of dignified. And, you know, a lot of our memories playing with him came from him being up and able to hang out with us instead of just being in his room barfing. Now, I do want to point out that it was my mom who illegally obtained the cannabis. So if there are any police that are looking for her, she's sitting right over there. But my dad accidentally fell into being a leader on the issue of cannabis and drug reform. He was not someone that necessarily was looking for the limelight, though he certainly didn't flinch from it. And he came to immensely enjoy the cannabis community. One of his absolute favorite activities was simply sharing a joint with a friend and chatting, or taking a smoke and walking in nature. But the point is, whatever the moment called for, he was up for it, even fighting for all of this through the grief and loss of his son, Danny. Now, my dad was incredibly unselfish. He refused to take a penny for anything, donating honorariums, giving away book rights. He always said yes to people who needed mentorship. He declined shares of companies. He was truly untainted and credible. Now, I'm not by any means saying that making a living working in these issues makes you tainted and uncredible. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm just making the point that I don't know anyone who is further beyond reproach and freer of any claims or charges of conflicts of interest, and that's part of why he was so successful. Now, he also really appreciated and cared about people, and he was a great judge of character. His assessments of people always proved to come true, and sometimes it took me like decades to realize that. This is probably why he was such a brilliant psychiatrist. He understood people, and this was one of his superpowers. Now, you know, people know him for the cannabis and the psychedelics and the nuclear stuff, but he was really a spectacular psychiatrist. He was also the person that everyone went to in a crisis. You could call him any time, and he'd be there. You know, if I were having a crisis in the middle of the night, which is sort of a bad habit I used to have, he'd calmly answer the phone and talk me through it, and then I'd fall back asleep. I mean, he was so generous about that. And he also had particularly good taste in a spouse, i.e. my mom. Anyone who met her or who meets her will attest that she is the nicest person in the world, bar none. They had an incredibly stable and supportive and loving relationship, still holding hands after 66 years of marriage, because they still like each other, not because they were like trying not to fall or anything. They were incredibly powerful as a couple. He was an extrovert, she's an introvert, but they nurtured and took care of everyone who came into their sphere. Now, my dad was unafraid to speak the truth. He admitted his use of cannabis and spoke about the benefits, defying this ridiculous taboo in the medical community against discussing the benefits of cannabis or other drugs. Like people don't already know that cannabis is fun and helps people with creativity. My dad also spoke about harms, but he just didn't buy into the strategy that if we only talk about the downside of drugs, we can somehow bamboozle people into not using them. And he was all about drug education, as epitomized by his book, Drug Control for a Free Society, which he wrote with Jake Bakalar, who's here in the audience and who's going to be in the first panel. Jake was his lifelong friend and co-author. And in that book, they asked, why do well-informed people often see less danger in drugs than ill-informed ones? Now, my dad was unafraid to take unpopular positions or to pioneer. I mean, David gave an example of him being the first person in North America to dispense lithium, but I'd give the example of, right when the war on drugs again was raging, he advocated for drastically lower criminal charges for cocaine possession. And had we listened to him, we would have avoided millions of arrests, broken families, dislocation, and misery. Now, my dad kept going in the face of headwinds, and David alluded to this. Harvard Medical was not particularly supportive of his work. For example, after being at Mass Mental Health Center for 35 years, he kept the same office for his whole career, the chief of the Consolidated Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical wrote him this letter in 1997. Dear Dr. Grinspoon, as I indicated in my telephone call with you, it is inappropriate and unacceptable for you to offer public pronouncements on your personal beliefs on the use of marijuana or other policy issues within Massachusetts Mental Health Center. This could clearly lead to confusion about whether your personal opinions represent policy of the Department of Mental Health and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. You are, of course, free to express your opinions as a private citizen and as a Harvard faculty member, but this should take place at an appropriate site, such as the medical school or your home. Sincerely, the chair of the Consolidated Department of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical. I translated this letter. This letter to me said, we are graciously permitting you to speak about cannabis, which you are the world expert in, only just not where you are physically sitting in the office where you've occupied for 35 years, as a decorated and beloved member of our academic staff, who's trained at least half of our psychiatrists over the years, and who also made us a ton of money through the Harvard Health Letter that you founded, because we fully support the government's fabricated moral panic about cannabis, and we are prioritizing this nonsense over the scholarship of our doctors. Thus, I am trying to intimidate you into silence. At least that's how I interpreted the letter. Needless to say, my dad completely ignored this guy and went on with his work. The same guy, at his first staff meeting, just meeting my dad, stated in front of the whole staff at Mass Mental Health Center, I've seen your book on psychedelics and I don't like it at all. My dad was like, nice to meet you too. And now, ironically, Harvard has a world-renowned center to study psychedelics. So my dad was denied full professorship, as documented by a brutal op-ed in the Harvard Crimson. In 2018, the Crimson said, given the circumstances surrounding his promotion, we believe these biases may well have had a significant effect on Grinspoon's attempt to become a full professor. This was called Grinspoon Reconsidered, by the way, same as our conference. The immense good Grinspoon's novel research has done for not only his discipline, but for society, for societal issues and law reform is difficult to dismiss and warrants recognition. It has been used to fight for the decriminalization of marijuana possession, which has disproportionately affected communities of color. In the future, we hope that researchers and members of the Harvard community make every effort to recognize novel contributions irrespective of societal trends. In other words, Don't target and intimidate your top academics. Now, my dad was very much unafraid of the limelight. In the early 1970s, his testimony was integral to keep Nixon from deporting John Lennon and Yoko Ono over this bogus drug charge. Needless to say, this was a high-profile case, but my dad was completely unfazed, and he'd help John Lennon. He'd also help anybody who was nobody. He just a very helpful person, very generous. As an aside, Nixon loathed my dad, calling him a clown in response to a summary of Marijuana Reconsidered in one of his daily presidential briefings, which one of our moderators, Dan Adams, dug up, which was really amazing to see. And my dad thought it was a badge of honor to be called a clown by a crook. My dad was adventurous to the point of recklessness. In 1994, Kerry Wiley, an American in Malaysia, was sentenced to death for medical cannabis use. And my dad went down to testify about medical cannabis and to execute them. And they ended up trying to have my dad arrested. He barely got out of there. He ended up saving Kerry Wiley from the death penalty, which is really amazing. And now Malaysia, ironically, is opening up about cannabis, sort of like Harvard Medical School. My dad was, in his own way, politically savvy. He provided the movement to end the war on drugs just what it needed at just the right time. In 1994, he helped NORML heal a rift by reorganizing the board, and he was felt to be the only person with the stature that anybody would listen to be able to do that. And as a consequence, NORML remains, 35 years later, a healthy, 25 years, a healthy, effective organization working on legalization. In 1971, his book, Marijuana Reconsidered, gave vast intellectual credibility to the legalization movement. And just to give one quote from Marijuana Reconsidered, because what conference about Lester would be complete without a quote, "We must consider the enormous harm, both obvious and subtle, short range and long term, inflicted on the people, particularly the young, who constitute or who will soon constitute the formative and critical members of our society by the present punitive, repressive approach to the use of marijuana. And we must consider the damage inflicted on legal and other institutions when young people react to what they see as a confirmation of their view that these institutions are hypocritical and inequitable. Indeed, the greatest potential for social harm lies in the scarring of so many young people and the reactive institutional damages that are direct products of the present marijuana laws. If we're to avoid having this harm reach the proportion of a national disaster within the next decade, we must move to make the social use of marijuana legal." And this was in 1971 when support for cannabis legalization was 12%. I mean, if you ask me, that's pretty brave. And then in 1993, his book, Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, provided a roadmap for patients because there really wasn't anywhere to get good information about medical cannabis. I mean, there still sort of isn't, but it was worse back then. And he also provided a direct appeal to the day's physicians. In Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, my dad explains, "The largely undeserved reputation of cannabis as a harmful recreational drug and the resulting legal restrictions have made medical use and research difficult. As a result, the medical community has become ignorant about cannabis and has been both a victim and an agent in the spread of misinformation and frightening myths. Someday, this systemic neglect of the research community will be remedied, and the authors of a book on the medical uses of marijuana will be able to review a large clinical literature." And we're currently entering that day. Again, he predicted the world that would come. And of note, 3 years after he published Marijuana, the Forbidden Medicine, California became the first state to legalize medical marijuana. Getting near the end. My dad loved to tell stories. One of his favorite stories goes as follows. During his early days of cannabis activist, when he was testifying before the US Senate, one particularly hostile senator, seeking what he thought was a wily way to discredit my dad, asked him, "Dr. Grinspoon, have you ever used cannabis yourself?" And my dad just chuckled and said, "Would I be more credible if I answered yes or no?" So over a span of 50 years, my dad persevered. In 2016, long retired, but still extremely active, he had the satisfaction of observing the legalization of cannabis in his home state of Massachusetts. There's a picture of him on the front page of the Boston Globe taking a huge puff. It's like, there's Dad smoking pot in the Boston Globe, taking a huge puff of the first joint that was legally sold in Massachusetts. Fittingly enough, the strain was named Jack Herer, named after another legendary activist. My dad called it a dream-fulfilling event. So in conclusion, the conversations that I eavesdropped on as a kid turned out not to be pie-in-the-sky fantasies. My dad largely accomplished what he envisioned. During his lifetime, he greatly advanced legalization, pushed psychedelics forward, and at least we have a nuclear test ban and fewer nuclear weapons. We're still limping along as a civilization, and we haven't blown ourselves up yet. What I learned, seeing the seeds planted in these idealistic conversations, planted so long ago, coming to fruition, is that if you try hard enough, educate yourself, work well with others, and do the right thing time and time again, you can change the world. Thank you.
That was awesome, Peter. We have a few minutes, which we don't actually have anything specific planned, but if anybody has any questions or comments, Peter and I could tag team up here a little bit. Or Peter, do you have any questions for me?
Yes, but none that I'd ask in front of a lot of people.
Yes, in the back.
Dr. Grinspoon.
Actually, that's a good question. I remember him as being pretty sort of, is omnivorous the right word? He was, people would, one thing that was funny or interesting about our household was that people were always sending him their favorite and giving him their favorite samples. So there was, there was no shortage because everyone was like, oh, Dr. Grinspoon, you got to try this. And so there was a lot around. But as a lot of you know, there is a strain, an heirloom sativa called Dr. Grinspoon. And he did, of course, get to try it. And I think he really did enjoy it greatly. And so probably if we had to name one, it would be that one.
And I'd say in general, sativas, he very much liked to talk to people, to brainstorm, to have creative ideas. It gave him insomnia. He said when he smoked, other people would fall asleep and he still want to be talking all night. And I just think he really liked the creativity and fellowship the sativas give him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. He really was a cannabis connoisseur. It was really one of his favorite hobbies toward the end.
And he loved that volcano. Yeah, there's a hand over here.
My mom's going to hate this, but toward the end, the last 10 years of his life, they lived in a, sort of elderly assisted living facility, really great places on a college campus. You have to take courses to live there. It's not you have to take courses. And you could navigate to my dad's home, his apartment, if you're driving, just by like closing your eyes and sniffing the cloud of marijuana smoke, the mushroom cloud. It looked like Bikini Atoll over their assisted living facility. So I would say quite frequently. See what David says.
I mean, that's true. I mean, interestingly, when he published Marijuana Reconsidered, he had never used it. So his main scholarship on, his foundational scholarship was done in the absence of any direct experiential use. And then he also talked about when he first tried it, nothing happened, which is often the case. And he had this moment of panic of thinking, uh-oh, what if this is all just like some placebo hoax thing that it doesn't actually do anything? But then he did become quite fond of the experience. And as he aged, I think especially after he retired, when he was, sitting around watching those owls on the computer and spent more time at home and people would come over, he was definitely a daily user at that point. We're almost out of time, but yes.
Who was his favorite son?
Oh, probably Josh. Softball question. Okay, last question over here.
Well, it's interesting. About 10 years ago, Harvard started gently, subtly airbrushing him back into reality. And I'm friends with I trained with the person who's head of the Harvard Museum of History. And about 8 years ago, he asked me for Lester's archives. And I felt really bad. I also felt sort of vindicated. I'm like, look, UMass asked for them 15 years ago. I can't take them from UMass and give them to you. So Harvard was interested, but they were slow in the uptake about this whole issue. It is really amazing now how Harvard is studying cannabinoids. Of course, that's with big donations, and they have a psychedelic center. It's really amazing. So I think about 8 years ago, they were interested in his archives, but UMass was prescient enough to ask them about 15 years ago or a while ago.
And this is such a great home for them, being the public state University of Massachusetts, and we're so glad that the archives and library people here are so interested in building something around those collections. So we couldn't be more thrilled that they're here. And Harvard, your loss. But yeah. And with that, I think we're going to take a break for half an hour. Anything else, Aaron, that I need to say? No? Okay, we're good. Thank you.
Thank you guys.